how all these forces relate to each other. Okay? So that's science. Well, but according to Harris, we're not just doing science, we're doing social science. Okay? So we want to go beyond this and look at what kind of special things do we have to know in order to make science into social science. Does anybody have an idea of what kind of things he talked about here? He talked about first the relationship between behaviors and mental states. Here I'll take an example from Dead Birds, right? So we saw this film Dead Birds not long ago, right? And I think there was a problem with this movie in many ways, because what this movie was good at, I thought, was showing people's behaviors. The movie showed people certain kinds of behaviors, in many ways much better than you can get from a written page. But what you don't get at all there is a mental state. When somebody writes about culture, they normally include information about what the people might be thinking who are carrying out these acts. I have to say, I had no idea of the character of the mental states of the people that chopped off the girls' fingers during the mourning ceremonies in Donnie culture, Dead Birds, right? Do you guys remember the bit with the fingers? Anybody? Yeah? Anybody else? Andrew, do you remember that from the film? Yeah. I found it odd, right? Why is it in Donnie culture, right, that these girls have their fingers chopped off, right? And I know it's linked to wartime, and we were told by the narrator that it's linked to the death of a person, right? So when a person dies, one of his young female relatives, we saw it was a girl, probably 6 or 7 years old, very young. I even younger than that. And she's subject to this behavior. What I don't have a sense of is what people are thinking when they're doing this, right? And Harris says, in order to understand culture, you have to understand that there's a separation of behavior and mental states. Now, mental states are difficult, right? Is it possible to know someone else's mental state in any direct way? What's in their head? Why not? Because you're not inside their head. Their mental states tend to be in the sort of philosophical nomenclature private, right? Their mental states are not shared with other people, except insofar as they report them, right? So Harris thinks that good ethnographers should deal with the reports of mental states, right, that people give. And notice this is really something missing from Dead Birds. And a lot of people talked about this when we did our critique of Dead Birds. There's no interviews in this movie, so you can't really talk about what's important to this culture, right, in terms of people's mental states. Okay. Harris wants to make clear, right, that you have to deal with mental states perhaps in the form of the way that people report them, but nevertheless they're important. That you can't understand people's behavior unless you understand their mental states. And you may not know exactly how they go together, because people can lie about their mental states. They can even be mistaken about their mental states. They can exaggerate them or play them down and so on, right? But nevertheless, you have to make some connection, right, between behaviors and mental states. And behaviors are just actions of body parts, right? That's just the way bodies move. And the second element that the social science has to have is this emic element, right? Which is to say, not only do you have to understand emic in the sense of, we talked about behaviors, right? That physically people are moving in a certain way. You have to understand the meaning of things, right? So to borrow from the example of the trade pact in Morocco from the Geertz reading, right? From an outsider's point of view, it's just a bunch of men come together at an empty spot in the desert. One man brings a lamb, kills the lamb, says some things, and everybody walks away. That doesn't tell you much of the significance. The emic point of view doesn't tell you about people's mental states, but it does tell you the meaning of what's going on, right? It does tell you the significance that people have, that people attribute it to it on the local level, okay? So he goes through, and if you want to look at this particular point, right, you want to look at page 8, okay? Because on page 8, he gives a long discussion of how you go from science to social science by focusing on these two things. Okay? Okay, so if this is what we need in order to make a social science into a science, we need to do all these things, and we need to do these two things. How is it that we get to cultural materialism, right? Or what is significant about the particular theory of cultural materialism as one is? And what I want you guys to notice here is that Harris is setting up standards for himself. Okay, if you look at your paper, I mean, if you look at the bullet points on the expository, if you look at the first one, what does it mean for something to be a science? And we'll just take Harris for now. Is Harris possibly defining science in the wrong way? Right? You can look at these and say, no, I think this is a bad definition of science. I don't think you can define social science in this way, and so on. Another question you might ask that I didn't put on there, right, is does Harris's theory of cultural materialism live up to this? Okay? So you can say no. Cultural materialism is never parsimony. I have my doubts about whether or not anthropology can ever be parsimonious. Why? Because you need a new theory for every culture, right? You usually can't use theories about one culture to explain another. That's hardly parsimonious. In physics, we don't use the physics of this room or the physics that's applicable on one part of the planet to explain physics on another part of the planet. But in anthropology, we have a new theory for every culture. That's not parsimonious, right? Maybe it's testable. That's another thing you could talk about, right? And so on. So you're going to ask yourself, does this theory of cultural materialism fit these? And that would be a great paper topic. Okay. So to do that, you have to understand what cultural materialism is. And to do that, let's remember, first of all, this is the same guy that talked about the cows in India and the mother cow in India. Does anybody remember what we talked about his basic belief about what culture is? I think I said it too when we introduced it. It's basically right that culture is something that exists to foster the achievement of individuals' survival and well-being. Here, let's look at page 9. This is right on page 9. So if you look, here he's talking about infrastructure, structure, and superstructure, right? I mentioned before what infrastructure was. It's these people's acts, their learned practice, the way that their habits, the way they always act. Structure he defines as economics and politics, basically. And then superstructure is basically sort of religion, morality, art. Right, the argument being that economics and politics are more basic to society, and that religion, morality, and art are added on top as the structure on the top. It's the superstructure. But regardless, right, and then the infrastructure is the acts that allow the superstructure, that allow the structure and superstructure to be realized, right? Okay, so what's the point of all that? The point of it all is, right, what culture does is it optimizes people's health and well-being. Okay? So Harris is making an argument, right, that culture, and this is right on page 9. Here, you guys might want to note this passage on page 9. Infrastructure constitutes the interface between nature and the forms of unalterable physical, chemical, biological, and psychological constraints on the one hand, and culture, which is Homo sapiens' primary means of optimizing health and well-being on the other. Cultural optimizations and adaptations must, in the first and last instance, conform to the restraints and opportunities of the environment and of human nature. Right? What he's saying, right, it's basically an evolutionary theory of culture. Right?